Hello and welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm excited that we have Jiahao back with us again today. We had so much to talk about last time that I think we decided another session was needed because, well, to be totally honest, there are not very many people out there that actually do algorithm or AI or machine learning audits. It's a very small community, and it's an even smaller community of people who actually have done them as opposed to sort of aspirationally would like to do them or are advertising that they do them. So it's great to have you back. So let me first, so one of the things that's on my mind, because there's so much excitement now about auditing. There was sort of some recent action at the federal level where they're starting to talk about what does it look like to do algorithm auditing or assurance. What kind of standards do we need to have? I say federal at the U.S. level, and I don't know if you caught the sort of some of the press releases or anything like that, but between that and New York City and a lot of the state and local laws, and then of course what's happening in the EU, especially with the Digital Services Act, which is going to require for sure, we don't know about the EU AI Act, but the Digital Services Act for sure is going to require independent, very clearly independent third-party inspection for compliance against the Digital Services Act. And some component of that is going to be looking at the algorithmic systems, things like recommender systems and the way ads are served and things like this. So on my mind, and I think a lot of people's mind now, is what do these auditors need to know? Like, what is an algorithm auditor, and how are they different than, let's say, a financial auditor, or how are they different from, let's say, just a researcher that is interested in fairness, maybe? So I want to get your thoughts. And of course, tell us anything else that you're excited about as well.
Well, thank you, Shay, for having me back. We had a great conversation last time, let's get into it. So, actually, last week I was at a workshop on the DSA, and one of the things that stood out as distinct to me is that the European regulations are starting to converge on a sense of like the systemic aspect of AI systems. So not just thinking about the AI system as an individual component in isolation, but also the context of use, how it is used in a pipeline or process with humans and other AI systems. So the EU DSA requirements seem to indicate that you actually do need a holistic systems level assessment. And this is in very distinct contrast with things like the New York City law, which are very specific about the individual component. So I think we're going to see in the future, I think some sort of ambiguity that needs to be resolved about what exactly is going to be needed, right? So as I think we may have talked about this last time, that the context of use is really important, because in an extreme case, you can audit an AI system all you want, but if it's used in a business process where the human decision maker just ignores the AI and just does whatever they're doing, then it's not effective. And so the audit was not going to catch any sort of bias or other concerns that are brought up entirely due to other components in the system. So I think this is something that is sort of still on my mind, and I think sort of like open question about what exactly the New York requirements are. Let me just pause there.
Yeah, I mean that's a good call out of the. So New York City is extremely narrow. Uh, when it's really, it's not even looking. They call it a bias audit, but it's not even a bias audit. It's a disparate impact audit, uh, and which is even narrower. And there are no requirements for risk management. There's no requirements for checking on risk management. So even auditing or asking about those or risk assessment. And yeah, it does seem like initiatives like the NIST risk management framework and what the European Union is thinking about is starting to capture that holistic piece. But as you rightly pointed out, that holistic piece includes a lot of humans and how they interact with the AI. And that kind of stuff, as I'm sure you are familiar with, like when you do a risk assessment to look at that, that's a pretty laborious process to go interview people, talk to people, think about controls. And so I think that there's a pretty big. I attended a sort of a workshop conference which was put on by Etiquus, which is a great sort of algorithmic auditing firm in Spain, and I think they've actually since moved to New York, or at least they have some presence in New York. And they brought quite a few stakeholders together who do audits from academia, and then a few of us from industry. And I think the consensus there was we have to push this socio-technical agenda, this agenda of looking at a broader scope. But what that actually entails is open is an open question. Like what exactly? Because how do you do that? And do you make the company do it, and then you check that they did it, or do you bring in outside people to do it? And I think that both are really. I think the second one is more powerful as a intervention, because you get that outside perspective, and if they are independent, or at least fairly independent, that can be, you can uncover a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to uncover. But it's also an open-ended process where it's like, when do you stop investigating? Like, is there a place where you terminate that process and say, okay, it's good enough for now, and then we'll check again next year? There's no question in there. It's just me thinking out loud.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of leading back to the other question of like what's the necessary skill set for an auditor, right? So if an auditor is only meant to look at the AI piece, then clearly you need like some level of like expertise with data science, and how do you do evaluations of AI systems? How do you verify performance models, things like that. But if there's the human component, there's the process level, then you're asking for more of a social science lens. You're looking for people who understand like sort of like IO psychology types of things, looking at possibly like, looking at like UX design as well, like in a broader sense of like, how does this whole business process work in an organization?
So let's go to the DSA for a second, because you sort of sparked my interest when you mentioned this workshop. The DSA is an amazing sort of microcosm of this. Well, it's not. I shouldn't say microcosm, because it's massive, right? And these are massive platforms, but it has many elements that are very disparate. Like they do have user interface kind of aspects to the requirements in terms of how disclosures that have to be made to people who use the platforms, and but they also have sort of human rights and fundamental rights kind of assessments, some of which are algorithmic based, others are more about how the people interact with platform and content moderation. And so it really will be a very clear case of having this big mix of things that you have to assess for. And you it's not clear whether it's going to be one firm, for instance, or one group of people can do all of it at once, or is it going to be? And maybe you can tell me what your thoughts are, because this, when I attended a workshop on the DSA earlier as well, and the European Commission, it seemed like the auditors that were there and the European Commission themselves weren't quite sure whether it's going to be like, hey, EY is going to come in and do everything, or it's going to be like different people will be doing different parts because they have expertise in those areas. And then you bring in the complexity of, there's explicit requirements for engaging with sort of third party, I don't know if they call them vetted researchers or whatever it's called, but it sounds like academics who have these sort of specialties. So it's going to be a real hodgepodge of stuff. What are your thoughts on how that might be managed?
Yeah, so something you mentioned earlier, I think is worth bringing out, which is like, I think we tend to think about algorithmic audits as contrasted to other kinds of audits. So, like finance being one, but also cybersecurity, I think is another model that people tend to talk about. So I think the difference here is that, well, obviously this is algorithmic auditing is a much less mature area, But one of the aspects of that maturity is that I think we, in general, at least in my experience, we don't seem to clearly distinguish between the actual audit and the prep work, the readiness aspect of preparing for the audit, right? So a financial auditor doesn't come in and like starts demanding information and like has to wade through data access and all of the stuff that are pain points for us today. Like it is assumed that when a financial auditor comes in, that everything is prepared for them and they're there to verify the information put in front of them, and only if they feel that the information presented is incomplete or possibly wrong that they start investigating, digging further. So I think this is something that we will have to sort out in fairly short order, and it goes back to this question of like who does what, in what capacity, who's representing the internal company, who's representing the external assessor, if it's a regulator, or maybe down the line if there's like a lawsuit, who's representing whom. I think these are all questions that start to come up, and we're obviously in a very early stage of things where like we're not anywhere close to answering these questions, but these are things that enforcement in regulatory agencies needs to think about. People who have vested interests like NGOs, nonprofits, if they're interested in the results of the audit, like how exactly do they get access to that data? On what grounds is this going to like bolster their case that such and such company is doing something bad, for example?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the civil society sector is watching very closely, and they're the ones who've been doing a lot of these sort of interrogations of the algorithms from the outside. And so a lot of the expertise I feel currently, and you correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different opinion, I feel like a lot of the expertise actually is sitting outside of these companies right now. Because inside the companies, I mean, there are a lot of smart data scientists for sure, but the focus is typically on production, and they are tracking a lot of metrics, and there are internal teams that have a general remit of responsible AI, but it's a different kind of mindset when you're really trying to hunt down problems. And yeah, I think there's going to have to be a lot of upskilling or bringing people in from the outside and making sure they have the appropriate access to figure that kind of stuff out.
Yeah, so if you look at how audit or sort of risk management is organized at banks, for example, being an industry that has had to deal with audits for a while, um, it's they have to be very carefully structured so that audit is a separate function that is distinct from the data science or ML production team, and it's to avoid internal conflict of interest, right? To make sure that the internal business teams that are being audited don't have the authority to squash anything, so that there's some guarantee, at least from an organizational perspective, that the audit can be done in a reasonable and manner without too much interference, right? But there's only so much you can do within the same company. So I think we're going to see in the future like that there will be internal teams that are primarily going to focus on audit prep or like even dry running audits, but that's not going to be the same kind of audit as what a regulator might want and come in and say, show me all your work. So like if the DSA comes in and says, hey, you're Amazon, I think you're like, you're discriminating against like small businesses. Show me the evidence that you're not. And then like, how do you prepare all the documentation to make sure that you have a case to argue that that's not actually what's going on?
Yeah, that's that's a really tough situation, and it does require it requires the external auditor to have a lot of access, or unlimited access. They have to be able to peek under the hood. And I mean, this is why the claims verification process is so important. I mean, we from our experience in doing audits for New York City, we are doing that external kind of audit. Like, we're not the ones who are actually doing the testing. We're not the ones who are doing the risk assessment, or clearly not the governance. But we have requirements under all those categories. And the only way that we can get away with that, so to speak, is that we have to go through a claims verification process. Like, first we have to see if the documentation lends evidence to being like it would satisfy our particular criteria, like that you've described things enough, you've justified things enough. And then we have to go in and actually do claims verification. And that part is tough. And that's where the risk is. And that's where having some infrastructure where you do have internal auditors that know where everything sits and could open doors for you and find data sets for you and find model repositories for you and show them to you. That's where it will be a lot easier when that infrastructure gets set up. But right now it's a very time. I'm guessing for the DSA audits for all of these big platforms like Meta and I guess Google because they do search algorithms as well. It's going to be a really expensive and a really involved process actually uncovering all of the places where there could be harm hidden. Like just thinking about fundamental rights, like knowing what fundamental rights could be infringed upon. Like it's pretty vague in the law, and then looking at their risk assessment and figuring out did they turn over enough stones to figure out, have a reasonable sort of cast a wide enough net to figure out which rights might be infringed on, and then going and seeing whether they did the right kind of testing or ask the right questions of people to figure that out. It's making me sweat just thinking about the amount of work that's going to be.
Yeah, but I think it and then starts to lead into the question of like audit for what purpose and who's doing it, right? So you mentioned civil societies and well, they clearly have an important role to play. They don't necessarily have the political power or any sort of enforcement authority to say that they want to see the data. So right, so like oftentimes we see very superficial audits because that's all they can do. And it's more about socio-technical context. It's more about here are the harms of using something like facial recognition. We don't know if this company is adequately mitigating them, but here's all the things we're concerned about. And it feels very one-sided that way because there's no input from the company, right? And the company is as companies do, they want to protect their reputation, and so like how do you engage with that in a constructive way? I think is something that people kind of need to think through, and I think that is an ongoing discussion that I think will start to evolve separately from like compliance, because compliance has very clear needs. There's at least who you talk to for what purpose. It's a lot clearer, and you're obligated to respond, which means that somebody inside has to be tasked with being responsible for delivering whatever is necessary for that audit. Whereas a civic society or investigative journalism audit, I think it's a lot tougher to get data that the company is willing to part with willingly. And so how do you go through that discovery process? Do you maybe the company is a government contractor and you can request records through government like transparency laws, or maybe you decide to bring a case against the company and the company is forced to turn over data as part of the lawsuit. That's pretty much, I think, the two broad mechanisms for civic society to actually get data. But as you can imagine, it's in a very adversarial context. It's also very expensive, and so people just want this to go away as quickly as possible. And so there's open questions of like, how can audits done by civic societies where do they fit in this landscape? Just because of the inherent politics of doing so.
Yeah, I think that's but that's going to play out in the DSA. I wonder how that's going to change the story because there are requirements in the DSA for the auditors to I forget now the exact language, but basically getting input from researchers or whatever the outside term is that they're using. But I think civil society could, or journalists for that matter. And one conceivable way, I think there are several conceivable ways of doing that. One is that the auditor plays the role of like an intermediary, where they can get access. They know that some civil society group has a really good method for auditing TikTok feeds or something like this, or potential filter bubbles on a platform. But they only can get so much data. But the auditor has access now because of the DSA, and then they can in some way facilitate these researchers getting more data to verify some claims that the company has made. The other way, which is probably more superficial, but my guess is it will more likely happen based on what I've heard from civil society and the lack of input they've been getting or having, is that the auditor will simply tap these reports that are done and published by civil society to check and say, okay, so has somebody checked whether about misinformation being spread in Iran prior to some date, right? The company said something about it, that's one of the great things they did to mitigate it. Somebody must have researched it. Oh, here's somebody who's published it. Let's take a look at that and see whether it matches up. That's more superficial. I mean, still useful, but I mean, what are your thoughts on that? But the potential sort of interaction that could happen there with the auditor, presumably of really strict independent third party auditor, to be a mediary between these two groups.
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible engagement mechanism where you basically bring in expert witnesses, and these can be academics, they can be NGOs, or like other experts that, it could be like, it could even be a situation where like maybe we're looking at like a big consultancy, like maybe Ernst and Young, like brings people like us in as more specialized auditors to help support a case, because that's also something that tends to happen. It's like there are people who specialize in very specific aspects of audit and compliance, and then they're brought in for more specific needs as well. I think this is definitely something that could happen, but then it's an issue of whether or not the cost justifies the need. Because I think that's one thing we talked about last time is that like audits are already like significantly more expensive than what most companies are willing to pay. And so while they deal with sticker shock, they try to deal with that in a very natural way to try to limit the scope of what's done, to save on the audit. And is that sufficient? I think we're going to see eventually some sort of industry consensus emerge on like what's the reasonable minimum amount of work needed to have a compliant audit, as opposed to the audit that people want, which could be very different.
Yeah, no, I think that process has to happen. The minimum viable audit, or minimum viable amount of transparency that you need to get confidence that people are meeting some minimum standard. Or I guess in the case of laws, I mean, it has to, the minimum standard is the law, right? The sort of letter of the law, and but there's so much interpretation on top of that. So I'm curious now. So let's play the role of the experts who've done these sort of things, and I'm coming to you. I'm working at Deloitte, and I have to audit Instagram or something, and I'm coming to you, and I want to know a little bit about what are your experiences. So I just want to hear like what your experiences have been in terms of sort of interrogating these algorithms. Like, what would you be like your ideal thing if somebody were to bring you in to help with one of these? What would you want to be working on that you feel like is like your sweet spot in terms of your specialization?
Yeah, so again, for me, like my background is in financial services, and we've seen we've seen some very long-standing requirements around some sort of audit, some sort of what the finance sector calls model risk or market risk management. And we also see like what the issues are with those regulations, because they're fairly old. They definitely predate modern AI or modern machine learning. And from that point of view, at least, now I think the parts that we can recycle, or like sort of the best practices we can adopt there, is having very strong focus on data quality and sort of minimization, I would say. So making sure that if you are feeding data into an AI system, is it actually relevant to the use case? If so, how do you justify that? And so this is something where I think it's an open question because it sort of flies in the face of modern ML, where it's more of a kitchen sink. It's just like we have every conceivable data stream about user behavior. Let's just throw everything in to try to predict whether or not the customer is going to buy something, right? But if you take a very strict traditional view on a model risk, there's actually requirements to make sure that the way you're able to make that decision is explainable. And that's actually like one thing that I think is not in the New York City law, but it's something that was in um, an article I read yesterday from Axios about how Chuck Schumer is interested in bringing together some sort of broader AI regulation and legislation. And so again, like in the very initial draft that he has, there's something about AI must be explainable. And now we're going to start asking the same questions about why did you use this feature? Is the data quality actually good enough that there's appropriate signal for what you want to measure? How do you define the thing you want to measure? These are things that start to surface again, and the same old questions, just possibly under the guise of trying to wade through like an enormous forest of slightly relevant or irrelevant features. I think that's going to be something that we're going to start seeing.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I know that NIST sort of incorporated model risk management concepts into the risk management framework. But how how does that actually play out in so is model risk management and the what is it, SR11 or something like this, which was the how does that get enforced in the financial services industry? Are there audits? Are there inspections? Is it all internal and you just produce a documentation that says we do this? How does that get enforced in financial services?
Yeah, so at least from my perspective on the inside, this is pretty much an internal effort to make sure that if you're developing anything new, it has to be approved by model risk management before you're allowed to use it in production. So there's very strict control flow to make sure that some sort of review is done prior to use. And uh, while regulators don't necessarily need to be proactively informed, it is oftentimes a good idea to give them a heads up, especially if you're a large company that you're about to do something, because then it sort of preps them and it gives you've at least made a good faith effort to signal that some sort of risk might be coming. Um, so the efforts to document and justify, they're basically done by an internal red team that focuses on model risk specifically. And the regulators can come in at any time and demand to see the proof that you've done this work. And like you could get into a lot of trouble for not doing that properly. So that's the very, very short version of how it works, at least from my perspective.
So so it's all right, so it's very different than for instance what New York is proposing for where you have this transparency that you have to publicly show your work. Here it's just you know what the guidelines are, you need to be doing it, and if we come knocking on the door, you better be prepared to show us you've done it. Um, and I guess that's what I'll, like. Well, you can. I'll ask you what your thoughts are. There's a lot of regulation, so there's a good chance that EU AI Act will have a similar kind of in practice. It might act very similarly. Like there will be probably conformity assessments, but those will be kind of looking at normally just like quality management systems, documentation, but it will mostly be sort of self-assessment that happens, and there won't be any kind of peeking under the hood. I mean, that may change. I hope it changes a little bit, but um, a lot of the laws that are being proposed, like the Algorithmic Accountability Act, that was about impact and risk assessments as well. Presumably, it's something that the FTC could get their hands on, but not necessarily proactively audited. And the same with some new laws in California. I mean, they're popping up all over the place. And what are your thoughts? Do you think that that's a good model? I mean, do you feel like it's worked in the financial services to just have this sort of, you don't know when we're going to show up, and but it's not necessarily a systematic yearly thing?
Yeah, so I think finance actually is a little opaque, and as you mentioned, like transparency is not actually a requirement. Like there's no need to post model documentation, and I can't think of a bank that actually does. And you would argue that like these documents are very sensitive. They tell these document like the internals of how we make critical business decisions, and it's proprietary and things like that. I think, but if you look at the history of like these kinds of regulatory enforcement, if you look at how the EEOC, for example, like decides who to go after, they have a field compliance manual. They have some sort of process for triage that says, we're going to rank basic cases essentially by um, estimated severity of like non-compliance and how much the probability to which we think that they're actually not being compliant. So, and this is a way to prioritize and sort of get the most bang for your buck for enforcement dollar, because at the end of the day, it comes down to whether or not these regulatory agencies have the budget to spend on enforcement. And that's going to determine, in fact, what's going to, what companies will actually have to do to avoid liability. It's going to be very different if you know that the regulator has all the resources it could imagine to police everybody on one extreme of the platonic ideal, and on the other extreme, it's so severely underfunded that basically it has no budget for enforcement. So it only goes through after like a couple of high-profile use cases, and that's it. So, and anything in between could happen. So I think that's where I think the high level structure has to meet like the actual on the road issues of very very mundane things like government procurement and budgets and how much resources they have for enforcement.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned the EEOC, and it seems like I have no idea what their budget has been looking like in the past few years, but they definitely have turned their eye towards AI as a sort of in their strategic plan and their enforcement plan. AI seems like, and in terms of stakeholder engagement, it seems like it's high on their list. Now, whether that translates into enforcement or if it's just trying to build capacity in the industry so that like you say, they might just triage it and go for really obvious and high-profile investigations. But it is interesting that funding is going to make a big difference. I mean, the DSA has pretty explicit, they're asking for funding from these platforms to fund the European Commission's efforts. I don't know if you've read that part of it, but they, and it's a lot of money, and it's the tunes of hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion per company to sort of help fund the enforcement efforts and also capacity building efforts at the European Commission. I can't imagine something like that happening in the U.S. Given that we let them not even pay taxes basically, so it seems unlikely that we're going to be asking them to fund our directly fund enforcement effort there. But okay, that's really interesting. So I trailed off because I forgot my original question. Could you tell us a little bit? Like, I'm curious to hear how have things. So after leaving the financial services, you go off. You start a couple businesses or help start a couple businesses. Some of which are focusing on algorithmic auditing. Tell us about what you're up to now. What are you most excited about? What are you doing now?
Yeah, so I'm working with a few companies who are interested to build tooling in this space as some sort of technical advisory capacity. And there's also interest from government agencies to understand what exactly they should be thinking about when it comes to uh, to bridging that gap between policy and sort of like operational aspects of things. So one thing I'm working on right now with the government agency is to understand this question of try before you buy procurement. So imagine if you're an organization that has very sensitive information, like maybe you have everybody's passport photos, and you're trying to deploy a facial recognition tool for uh, like video monitoring or like passport control or something like that. So you have a situation where uh, you have a situation where imagine if you start the usual contracting and like tendering process that you get bids and the vendors say like, buy our thing like has like X% performance, blah, blah, blah. You get the glossy brochure and now the agency says, okay, sure, that sounds good, but I need to demonstrate that it works with my data. And now you're in a situation where uh, you're not going to hand over this sensitive data because like that's just a non-starter. It's not going to leave your servers. The vendors are going to be loath to send their code and models to you because it's their proprietary IP. And so how do you break that logjam? Right now, the answer is either you give it to us or we're just not going to buy it,
Yeah.
or or like the agency just caves in and says like, okay, fine, we'll buy it, and then like you end up with like a boondoggle of like, you bought something very expensive that doesn't work, and so there clearly has to be a better solution to this problem, and it comes down to what again, like not necessarily audit in the sense of enforcement now, but audit in the sense of like providing an honest picture of what your product can and cannot do, and how do you provide that as a honest assessment. So now we're in a situation where it's not necessarily about compliance, but it's more about branding. It's about the AI equivalent of uh, like materials testing. Like how do you make sure that like the steel that you're using for this building is up to spec and it's not going to collapse if you use it to hold weight, that kind of things. And how do you build that kind of testing infrastructure and process?
So something more like akin to like a trust mark or like a SOC 2 kind of, or whatever I mean, the U.S. government has their own, like the Department of Defense has one. I'm forgetting the name of it now for cybersecurity. Something along those lines, or are you more interested in building the infrastructure? Because those things are something that an auditor could go do and get that mark, or are you thinking more like the agency has the infrastructure themselves to uh, to process or get that sort of assurance that these tools might work, or maybe it's a mix?
I think right now it's so early in the process that I don't really know the right answer to
Yeah.
that. And I think it's more an interesting question from a technical perspective of how do you ensure that two parties can share data for a very limited purpose of testing and quality assurance, while ensuring that at the end of the process, uh, like no one's stealing anyone's data, right? So like how do you, and especially like if your vendor is suspected to have possibly like sanctioned behavior, right? How
Mm-hmm.
do you make sure that your model's not phoning home and sending every single uh, data point, like phoning that home to possibly like a third country,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that starts to become like of actual importance, to make sure that you are able to test it. And so how do you build that sandbox environment to make sure that it works? So the sandbox has to be secure, but also sufficiently realistic to simulate the actual operating environment.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be. So it can't be as simple as API access to the model. Like it, are you envisioning something a little less black boxy, something that's more, let's look at how the data is getting transferred, uh, as opposed to just, we're gonna feed passport photos to your API and then see how it does.
Yeah, so I think this is again going to be an evolving process, and it's quite likely we'll end up with a continuum of possible answers, depending again on cost and budget.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. I think I mean, the U.S. government is going to have to get. Well, forget the U.S. government. I think that if I were to think right now about the future of AI auditing or algorithm auditing, and I have to think about it a lot because that's what my company does. I My guess is that it's going to be a lot less compliance based. Like New York is kind of a fluke. My guess is New York is a fluke right now, and the requirements for like hard third party auditing is not going to be showing up a lot in law. Even the EU AI Act, it won't be the same. It'll be a different kind of animal. And most of the AI audit work will really be for assurance for large, let's say large enterprises that want to get vendors, and they want to have some confidence, or government agencies that want vendors, and then you need some sort of confidence that they are doing things responsibly. And then having more of these assurance audits, what you can call it, just assurance engagement or an audit, it really, either way is I'm happy to call them either, from some external party. I think that's where most of the work will be in the next kind of 5 years. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I think that what I see is that's going to be the driver. It's going to be some big companies, and it's already happening. Some big companies saying, we've already been in the press for doing bad things before. We don't want to take on a vendor who has some discriminatory software, or has data, data privacy issues, or could has some language model that could potentially be offending people. What are your thoughts? Do you see that as the way it's going to go?
I think this is again totally open question of where the industry is going to evolve, right? And I think like people don't like compliance. Like it's just like it's an obstacle, it's a hindrance to progress. Like that's the sort of the default worldview that comes in when you start talking about compliance. And so when I was working on algorithmic discrimination research at banks, like I was trying to not cast it as purely a compliance issue, but like how is there a win-win that's possible? Like what's the value proposition actually investing in this work? And is there a way to avoid this implicit assumption of zero sumness?
Yeah.
Like you have to be fair, and that's going to come at the cost of stifling your core business. Like nobody is going to want to do that, and they're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into a world of compliance and therefore do only the bare minimum. And so I'm interested in these kinds of work on testing and certification, because ultimately it's about how do you present your product in the best possible light, and that's a much more tangible business proposition to say. If you look at some of the early clients that I had, like they're interested to demonstrate that they're first in the market to show compliance, and therefore like we're being progressive, therefore buy our thing.
Yeah.
Uh, as a way to pitch their tool, as opposed to being a laggard and saying that, okay, fine, I have to do this now, and then sort of, because you're not willing to open up your wallet that much, if that's what you have to do, and you're just going to say like, okay, what's the least amount of work I need to do to make this go away?
Yeah. Yeah. I think casting it as a brand differentiator, or um, you know, or as something that's like the future of your company, or being a leader. I mean, that's why it's so important to talk to the C-suite, to talk to the CEO, the people in the companies who are thinking 10 or 20 years ahead. That's way more effective, at least from my experience, than talking to some product person who has a task to either be compliant or not, or they have the vision is very limited. It's much better to get those people who kind of see the future and what it's going to look like, and where do they want their brand to be, clearly on the right side of history when it comes to these sort of technologies. Well, thank you so much. So I'm gonna end it here. I think we probably could keep talking forever, but I really appreciate you showing up for a twofer and coming two different times. And where can people follow you? Where are you most active?
Yeah. So thanks again for having me. For my professional work, most of it's on LinkedIn. My website is responsibleai.tech if you're interested, and I have yeah. So I think I'll just leave it at that. And I do have a newsletter that I write monthly. The April edition is overdue, but I feel like uh, when
So,
I worked on this, I thought this was going to be an excuse for me to clear all my bookmarks, and now it feels like a marathon of like keeping up with the deluge of news that happens every day in this field. But yeah, so I have a Substack that you can look up on my website. It's free, so if
all
you're
right.
interested, definitely have a look at that.
Well, we'll link everything both on YouTube. It will be in the comments. We'll link your website and your LinkedIn and Substack. Thank you again. Thanks everybody else for showing up and listening. If you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on podcast, thank you for listening. And I'll see you next time on Lunchtime Babbling.
Thanks again for having me.
Thanks.